Hey, what's up? I'm Damon Garcia, bringing you perspectives from the Christian left, and today we're talking about how the goal of socialists are to do what the early church tried but couldn't do, and what the modern church won't and refuse to do. Trust me, just watch, it'll all make sense. Let's get into it. So we've been going through Rosa Luxemburg's document, Socialism and the Churches, written in 1905. And we're in part 6, so make sure you go watch the other 5 parts before this one, so it makes way more sense. And I just want to remind you how in the first one we talked about how during this time, Rosa was gathering workers to lead strikes against Germany going into war, which ended up being World War I. And for these protests and other political activities, she was arrested multiple times during this period in her life when she wrote this. And one of the people criticizing her and the protesters were the church leaders. Clergy were preaching sermons against them instead of encouraging people in sermons, telling the workers to just accept your lot, be humble, don't be a rebel, don't protest. So let's continue in this. Part 6. After having briefly reviewed the history of the church, we cannot be surprised that the clergy supports the Tsarist government and the capitalists against the revolutionary workers who fight for a better future. The class-conscious workers organized in the Social Democratic Party fight to bring into reality the idea of social equality and of fraternity among men, the object which was formerly that of the Christian church. I love this. She's saying, like, this used to be what the Christian church was trying to do. Now we're trying to do it. Nonetheless, equality cannot be realized either in a society based on slavery, nor in a society based on serfdom. It becomes capable of being realized in our present period, that is the regime of industrial capitalism. What the Christian apostles could not accomplish by their ardent discourses against the egoism of the rich, the modern proletarians, workers conscious of their class position, can start working in the near future by the conquest of political power in all countries, by tearing the factories, the land, and all the means of production from the capitalists to make them the communal property of the workers. The communism which the Social Democrats have in view does not consist of dividing up between beggars and rich and lazy of the wealth produced by slaves and serfs, but an honest, common, united work and the honest enjoyment of the common fruits of that work. So yeah, just to be clear, consistently whenever certain conservatives hear of social programs, hear of the rich giving money to the poor, they shout, socialism! That's not socialism. That's just charity and social programs. Socialism is trying to get to a place where there is no rich and poor. So she continues, socialism does not consist of generous gifts made by the rich to the poor, but in the total abolition of the very difference between rich and poor, by compelling all alike to work according to their capacity, by the suppression of the exploitation of man by man. And I just want to reiterate, we're not going to get into the details of Rosa Luxemburg's communist vision, but I want to say her vision for communism was never tried. And then years after this, of course, Lenin led the revolution in 1917, and she was very, very critical of the way Lenin was running things. She goes on, for the purpose of establishing the socialist order, the workers organize themselves in the Workers' Social Democratic Party, which pursues this aim. And that is why the social democracy and the workers' movement meets with the ferocious hatred of the possessing classes, which live at the expense of the workers. The enormous riches piled up by the church without any effort on its part come from the exploitation and the poverty of the laboring people. The wealth of the archbishops and bishops, the convents and the parishes, the wealth of the factory owners and the traders and the landed proprietors are bought at the price of the inhuman exertions of the workers of town and country. For what can be the only origin of the gifts and legacies which the very rich lords make to the church? Obviously not the labor of their hands and the sweat of their brows, but the exploitation of the workers who toil for them. Serfs yesterday and wage workers today. Further, the allowance which the governments today make to the clergy come from the state treasury, made up in the greater part from the taxes wrung from the popular masses. The clergy, no less than the capitalist class, lives on the backs of the people, profits from the degradation, the ignorance, and the oppression of the people. The clergy and the parasitic capitalists hate the organized working class, conscious of its rights, which fights for the conquest of its liberties. For the abolition of capitalist mixed rule and the establishment of equality between men, which strike a moral blow, especially at the clergy, which exists only thanks to exploitation and poverty. But above all, socialism aims at assuring to humanity an honest and solid happiness here below, to give to the people the greatest possible education and the first place in society. It is precisely this happiness here on earth which the servants of the church fear like the plague. Because it's so easy to say, yeah, just accept your lot, don't protest, don't try to change things, and if you keep doing that, you'll have paradise after you die. But she's like, we're trying to make things better here and now on this earth. We're trying to bring some heaven to earth, as the early apostles were trying to do. And that kind of society would make it a lot harder for the church to exist as it has, which I think Christians should just fully embrace the new. Acknowledge that God is pulling us into greater and greater things, different from how it used to be, instead of clinging so hard onto how it used to be, onto the old traditions, onto just an old time that we'll never get back. She goes on, the capitalists have shaped with hammer blows the bodies of the people in chains of poverty and slavery. Parallel to the clergy, helping the capitalists and serving their own needs, enchain the mind of the people, hold it down in crass ignorance, for they well understand that education would put an end to their power. Once people start getting it, start seeing, start understanding, start knowing, they're not gonna just stay under the thumb of the empire. Well, the clergy, falsifying the early teaching of Christianity, which had as its object the earthly happiness of the lowly, tries today to persuade the toilers that the suffering and the degradation which they endure come not from a defective social structure, but from heaven, from the will of providence. Oh man, that's so twisted. And yet I see it even today. You're suffering not because the social structure, not because society, not because the world needs to change, but because God. God is doing something. Either they'll say God is testing you, or maybe you're living in sin and that's why things are the way that they are, or you need to just pray more, or have more faith, or you're just not doing Christian things enough and that is why you're suffering. It's really awful. And it is also what, in the book of Job, Job's friends all said to him in his suffering. They all had their explanations, and it ends with God saying, "You're all wrong." But he says it by saying, "Where were you when I created the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I created this beast and this ocean and these ice caps?" Like, he points to all the chaotic elements of nature and says, this whole thing is filled with chaos. Where were you when I created it all? And you're trying to say that you know why things are the way they are? You're trying to give meaning to everything and put it on God? Don't do that. So we should know from reading the Bible as Christians to never say, the reason you're suffering is because, and then give some divine reason. And it's especially twisted when the reasons are the social structure, but we say, no, you're just not being good enough. Anyway, she goes on to say, thus the church kills in the workers the strength, the hope, and the will for a better future, kills their faith in themselves and their self-respect. Yeah, even today I'm thinking how often pastors talk about, like, don't be involved in politics, don't be political, don't protest, don't get caught up in politics, just be caught up in your faith, the prayer and the rituals and the church meetings, and just focus on that. Don't try to be political. That's what the world does. She goes on, the priests of today, who with their false and poisonous teachings continually maintain the ignorance and degradation of the people. Here are some irrefutable proofs. In the countries where the Catholic clergy enjoys great power over the minds of the people, in Spain and in Italy for instance, the people are held down in complete ignorance. Drunkenness and crime flourish there. For example, let us compare two provinces of Germany, Bavaria and Saxony. Bavaria is an agricultural state where the population is preponderantly under the influence of the Catholic clergy. Saxony is an industrialized state where the Social Democrats play a large part in the life of the workers. They win the parliamentary elections in nearly all the constituents, a reason why the bourgeoisie shows its hatred for this red social democratic province. And what do we see? The official statistics show that the number of crimes committed in ultra-Catholic Bavaria is relatively much higher than that in red Saxony. Isn't that interesting? You'd think the province where the church had more influence, they would be better people and not do bad things as much. Yet, she's saying, no, actually those are where people commit way more crimes. A wholly similar situation is found when we compare the record of crime in priest-dominated Posen with that in Berlin, where the influence of social democracy is greater. In the course of the year, we see for every 100,000 inhabitants in Posen, 232 cases of assault and battery, and in Berlin, 172 only. In the Papal City in Rome, during one single month of the year, 1869, the last year but one of the temporal power of the popes, there were condemned 279 for murder, 728 for assault and battery, 297 for robbery, and 21 for arson. These are the results of clerical domination over the poverty-stricken people. This does not mean to say that the clergy directly incite people to crime. Quite the contrary. In their sermons, the priests often condemn theft, robbery, and drunkenness. But men do not steal, rob, or get drunk at all because they like to do so or insist upon it. It is poverty and ignorance that are the causes of it. Therefore, he who keeps alive the ignorance and poverty of the people, he who kills their will and energy to act out of this situation, he who puts all sorts of obstacles in the way of those who try to educate the proletariat, he is responsible for these crimes just as if he were an accomplice. That's so heavy. This idea that the places where the church has the most influence, there ends up being more crimes, not because they're encouraging crimes, but because they're often keeping people ignorant and telling them to not try to change their social situation. And they wind up making self-destructive decisions because of their poverty and ignorance. She goes on, and the situation in the mining areas of Catholic Belgium was similar until recently. The Social Democrats went there. Their vigorous appeal to the unhappy and degraded workers sounded through the country, saying, "Worker, lift yourself up. Do not rob. Do not get drunk. Do not lower your head in despair. Read. Teach yourself. Join up with your class brothers in the organization. Fight against the exploiters who maltreat you. You will emerge from poverty. You will become a man." I find this so intriguing because this is asking people to take individual responsibility over their lives. And today, one of the most influential thinkers, as people say, is Jordan Peterson, who is, I guess, like a classical liberal, and he is one to constantly criticize Marxism and all those ideas and leftism and say that the problem is that they don't encourage individual responsibility. And he's constantly talking about taking individual responsibility and saying things just like this, like, lift your head, read, teach yourself, become a man. And so many of the people that he's telling this to grew up in homes where they were never encouraged to take individual responsibility over their lives. So it's like mind-blowingly helpful for so many people when he says simple things like, clean your room, have goals for your life, and then go after them. So I just find it super interesting that Rosa Luxemburg is saying the same thing, but from a Marxist point of view, from a leftist point of view, which several people say does not teach taking individual responsibility. But there is that, at least from Rosa Luxemburg here. Let's continue. Thus, the social democrats everywhere lift up the people and strengthen those who lose hope. Rally the weak into a powerful organization. They open the eyes of the ignorant and show them the way of equality, of liberty, and of love for our neighbors. Oh, man. Love for our neighbors. You know, all this stuff that the church was supposed to be teaching, that Christians were supposed to be teaching. On the other hand, the servants of the church bring to the people only words of humiliation and discouragement. And if Christ were to appear on earth today, he would surely attack the priests and the bishops and the archbishops who defend the rich and live by exploiting the unfortunate. As formerly he attacked the merchants, whom he drove from the temple so that their ignoble presence should not defile the house of God. Yeah, that was the kind of person Jesus was. Of course, he would see the same stuff and do the same thing today that he did with the merchants. That is why there is broken out a desperate struggle between the clergy, the supporters of oppression, and the social democrats, the spokesmen of liberation. And the clergy and the Christians are supposed to be the spokesmen of liberation. Is this fight not to be compared with that of the dark night and the rising sun? Because the priests are not capable of combating socialism by means of intelligence or truth, they have recourse to violence and wickedness. Their Judas talk calumniates those who rouse class consciousness. By means of lies and slander, they try to besmirch all those who give up their lives for the workers' cause. These servants and worshippers of the golden calf support and applaud the crimes of the Tsarist government and defend the throne of this latest despot who oppresses the people like Nero. You know, the guy who killed Christians. Now Christians are being like Nero. And this also was a very similar critique in the first 7 chapters of Revelation. The beginning of Revelation is John writing letters to 7 different churches. And some of his biggest critiques is saying, guys, you're on the side of Satan. You're on the side of the empire. And he criticized Christians who were saying they're following Jesus and taking the mark of the beast. And the beast was the name given to Roman emperors, to the Caesars. It's like, you can't serve both. Okay, last paragraph. But it is in vain that you put yourselves about, you degenerate servants of Christianity who've become the servants of Nero. I just love that, because this is an atheist saying this, but this is also what the pastor John of Patmos says in the New Testament as well, that gives the same exact critique and insult to his fellow Christians, trying to get them to come out of their evil ways. And this has remained a weakness of the church throughout all history. She goes on, it is in vain that you help our murderers and our killers, in vain that you protect the exploiters of the proletariat under the sign of the cross. Your cruelties and your calumnies in former times could not prevent the victory of the Christian idea. It's like, you Christians could not stop the Christian idea. The idea which you have sacrificed to the golden calf. Today your efforts will raise no obstacle to the coming of socialism. Today it is you and your lies and your teachings who are pagans, and it is we who bring to the poor, to the exploited, the tidings of fraternity and equality. It is we who are marching to the conquest of the world as he did formerly, who proclaim that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Preach it, Rosa. That is part 6. So, as I've been saying before, it is the job of Christians to do what they can to help change the world in a way that helps the poor and the downtrodden, serving Jesus, who said, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. And it's like, I feel like part of the rise of the socialists, part of the rise of the revolutionary left, is because Christians weren't doing their job. And that's heavy. I think Christians need to come to terms with that. You don't like the revolutionary left? The only reason they exist is because of what Christianity has become and how they stopped following the radical faith of Jesus. That's a sobering and humbling thought that I think all Christians need to come to terms with. So, I'm not trying to make any of you subscribe to socialist or communist ideologies or leftist ideologies at all. No. I just want Christians to be able to stop and reflect and think about, why are these ideologies becoming so popular? And what are the roles of Christians, and how can we help change things? So, that is the purpose of this whole thing. Thank you for watching. Part 7, the last part, will be the next video where she wraps the whole thing up. So make sure you watch that. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you, Rosa. And thank you for watching. See you later.